So yes, hi, thank you all for coming. I'm Thomas, and the past few months I've been working with Paolo and Sonia on my master's thesis project as part of the program of environmental engineering. And this is titled, as you can see, hydraulic tomography coupled to dissolved oxygen monitoring measurements of a managed aquifer recharge system. So after a brief introduction on the motivation and context behind this work, the presentation is structured into two broad parts, in which first I describe hydraulic tomography that was performed on an artificial aquifer system in Palamós, and then I discuss the monitoring of dissolved oxygen that was performed on the same system during the tomography. So if I had to summarize the theme of this work in one phrase, it would be supply of clean water. As we all know, it's fundamental for sustaining life. But as we also all know, there are moments, there are episodes where we don't have enough of it through traditional sources like aquifers and reservoirs. So to address this scarcity, one alternative that's being developed is water reclamation. This involves essentially obtaining water from different sources, such as stormwater, but very frequently wastewater, and treating it to such a degree that it can be used for new uses. Which can be agricultural irrigation, or as fluid in industrial cooling towers, and theoretically even as drinking water. This, of course, increases our supply of fresh water without depleting sources like aquifers or reservoirs I mentioned, but does come with a significant drawback of being quite expensive, currently being quite energy intensive and therefore expensive. So an alternative to the alternative is what I describe here, the combination of soil aquifer treatment with managed aquifer recharge. So the aquifer treatment, it takes advantage of the soil's capacity to filter water via biodegradation absorption of the contaminants. And if you combine this with a reactive layer, shown on this slide, it can enhance this contaminant removal. But of course, as we all know, aquifers not only filter water and contaminants, it can also store water. So you can use this capability to store the water that you recharge in the aquifer to access it later on in times of need. So with this in mind, a pilot project has been started.
Perdona que te interrumpa, no están pasando las transparencias.
Vale, un momento.
Yeah. Sí. Salgo de ahí.
¿De dónde?
Del PowerPoint.
PowerPoint.
Y vuelve a avanzar.
Oh, vale.
Yo puedo sacar allí abajo.
Aquí.
Sí.
Bueno, eso mismo.
Bueno, lo mismo.
Sí. Un momento, Tere. Te explico otra cosa. Tere, us veu ara?
A veure... Sí, ara sí. Disculpa, Tomàs.
No, és culpa meva. Torno a començar o...
No, continua on t'has quedat, però amb la transparència que toca.
So with all this in mind that I was talking about with aquifer recharge and soil aquifer treatment, a pilot project has been developed in the wastewater treatment plant of Palamós to investigate and innovate new ways of improving what we currently have in terms of the soil aquifer treatment technology. In particular, one area of study that I want to look at is chaotic flow, which involves essentially recharging the aquifer through a recharge area, as you see here, and which is partially treated wastewater. And then somewhere down gradient from the recharge point, a series of extractions and injections are performed in order to maximize the volume of aquifer that the water comes in contact with. The rationale behind this, the reason we want to do this, is if you do this greater mixing of the water, you get and coming into contact with a much greater area and volume of the aquifer. You get, of course, a higher rate of reaction and therefore a greater rate of contaminant removal. But, of course, for an effective design of an experiment regarding inhibited flow, which is all about hydraulics, we need to first understand the system's hydraulic characteristics. For example, if we perform an extraction from one place, does it require a significant degree of pumping to get an important and substantial amount of water out? And if we then inject it somewhere else, will that water spread quickly or slowly? And another thing we were interested in was the role of dissolved oxygen in the system. As I said before, one of the key roles, key processes in the contaminant removal in the aquifer is biodegradation, which in simple terms is the microbially mediated oxidation of the organic matter. And oxygen happens to be the most thermodynamically favorable of the species usually available in these systems. And because of this thermodynamic favorability, it's preferentially consumed and therefore highly relevant to these experiments where biodegradation is one of the processes of interest. So to quickly summarize the objectives, of this study was to determine the hydraulic characteristics of one of the systems in the pilot project of Palamós, which was done through hydraulic tomography. Second, to find out if there are any effects of these levels of dissolved oxygen in the groundwater, any effects of the pumping test on these levels of dissolved oxygen. And third, to establish if there are any correlations between these levels of oxygen and the hydraulic connectivity determined through the first objective. The hydraulic tomography was performed on, as I said, one of the 6 systems that was built in the treatment plant. This consists of a empty concrete tank with dimensions shown on the slide, which had been filled up with sand of 0.1 to 0.2 millimeter grain size, giving it a homogeneous composition. The RB refers to reactive barrier, through which all of the effluent wastewater goes into before then entering the aquifer and traveling through the aquifer. The aquifer had been perforated with several piezometers, but only 7 of them were used for the monitoring of hydraulic head in these experiments, which are labeled in green in this diagram. Each piezometer is identified first according to the section it lies in, with a letter. You can see here A, B, D, and C, and by the number which represents its height above the base of the tank. Looking at this oblique projection, you can see the piezometers labeled 1 are those closest to the base of the tank, and those labeled 3 are furthest from the base. These red arrows represent the piezometers from which extraction occurred and on which pumping tests. So hydraulic tomography is a series of protocol pumping tests. What this means is that, as we saw, there were several different pumping tests performed, each on a different piezometer, and while these tests occurred, the hydraulic head is monitored simultaneously across all the piezometers labeled in green. The response to this perturbation, which is the pumping, is a drawdown, and this drawdown can be analyzed to calculate 2 key hydraulic characteristics, which are 2 key hydraulic parameters, which are transmissivity and coefficient of storativity. So as I said, there were 4 extraction wells used sequentially. The pumping lasted for 3 hours, except for the case of the pumping in A3, where it only lasted half an hour because the well ran dry after only half an hour, so it was forcibly stopped. After the pumping, the aquifer is allowed to recover for at least 20 hours, except for, once again, one exception, which was DCP2, where unfortunately there was an infiltration from the adjoining tank, and so there was still perturbation, which caused that recovery to be cut short. The rate of extraction was approximately 0.7 liters per minute throughout. The hydraulic head was monitored using a diver, well, using several divers with measurements occurring every 5 seconds. So these are the initial results, the hydraulic heads in the 7 piezometers over the full pumping tests. Each graph represents a different pumping test, and each line the hydraulic head in a piezometer. So as you can see, there's and the times are expressed relative to the start of pumping, which is defined as time 0. As you can see, soon after pumping, there is a quick, sharp drawdown, which tapers off slightly as time passes, and an almost mirrored behavior in the recovery. Also, there's an overall quite smooth behavior, and as you can see, the final recovered levels are the same as initial levels, all of which indicates a fairly ideal behavior. Of course, in the case of the third pumping test, as you can see, as very soon after pumping started, this more erratic behavior, which is when the well ran dry, and which of course had to be stopped. And because of this very short pumping time, you can see the response in the other piezometers is much lower than in the other days, even to the extent of being negligible in the case of C1, which of course means that consequently the regression analysis performed later will be of lower quality. Actually, in fact, C1, I'd like to mention that you can see across all 4 pumping tests, it has a much more lackluster response compared to the other piezometers. And so, once again, that will impact the quality of the analysis performed on it. And finally, as you can see in the 4th pumping test, you can clearly see where I have to cut the data where the hydraulic head went much beyond the initial level because of the external infiltration. So this drawdown data was interpreted with 4 different methods: the TICE drawdown and recovery methods, the AGOL recovery method, and a modified AGOL recovery method, which was developed by researchers here in the UPC. What is involved, in simple terms, is the conversion of the hydraulic head into terms of drawdown. In the case of the drawdown method, you take the drawdown soon before the pumping phase ended, and for the recovery, you look at the residual drawdown, which is the drawdown after the pumping has stopped. All these rely on the same key assumptions, which are listed on the slide, and perhaps the most important of these is the Cooper-Jacob approximation is valid, which states that at late times, so in terms of the drawdown method, it means that at times soon before pumping ended, and in terms of the recovery methods, the time soon before the recovery ended, or at short radial distances between the pumping well and the observation well, the flow towards the pumping well is radial. What this actually means, or what it signifies, is that if you plot the drawdown versus log time, so on the left you have the plots of drawdown versus linear time. If you convert this to logarithm of time, this section here, which is the time soon before pumping ended, is linear, and therefore you can perform a simple linear regression analysis to obtain estimates of the transitivity and storativity. So this is an example of the results obtained for one of the piezometers across all 4 pumping tests, and for both the transitivity and the storativity. As you can see, for each pumping test, I obtained 4 different estimates using 4 different methods, and from these I obtained a geometric average and the corresponding standard deviation factor. As you can see, both across methods and across days pumping tests, the results are very similar, and also you can also see that in the standard deviation factor that they don't tend to go beyond 1.3, and the same is visible here in the storativities. There is one small exception, which is the third pumping test, which was seen across all of the different piezometers. The third pumping test, if you recall, is where there was a very short pumping phase because of the well running dry, and therefore, of course, the signal was much lower, and therefore the value of the quality of the regression isn't as high, and that caused the greater spread in the estimates calculated. And it's also reflected in the slightly higher deviation factor here and here. Of course, as you saw, the C1 piezometer also gave a much smaller response in general across all 4 days, and also you couldn't really see it in the earlier hydraulic head slides, but they had a considerably greater spread in the hydraulic head values, and therefore once again that created a much greater spread in the analysis, in the regression analysis as well, which is clearly visible in the deviation factors here, which are much larger. That can also be appreciated visually here. You can see here for the same pumping test, but in two different piezometers, the PCP2 and the 41C1, that here there's a much smaller spread in data, which results in a much better regression analysis, better fit, which is reflected in the R-squared value, whereas here in C1 it doesn't reach 0.4. So if we look at the good quality data, which basically will be all the data that doesn't involve the third pumping test and the data at C1, we can see that for a given pumping test and piezometer, the four methods are in very good agreement, which we can see, which can determine numerically from the fact that for transmissivity and sorority, the deviation factor doesn't go beyond 1.3 and 1.44 respectively, and this is across all pumping tests and across all piezometers. Whereas for the low quality data, as I said, the one at pumping test 3 and C1, the same values are much greater, above 2. So looking at the actual results that we got from it, we see that the transmissivity lies in a relatively narrow range of 2 to 14 square meters per day, which in hydrogeological terms is practically indistinguishable, which to be fair is as expected for a homogeneous medium like this. It also happens to match perfectly with the prediction made by the empirical relationship established between granulometry, which if you recall was 0.1 to 0.2 millimeters, and hydraulic conductivity. So it's a good sign that things are probably working well and the results are likely valid. And this level of transmissivity, or to categorize that on a boundary between conductive and non-conductive. In terms of the sorority, once again, we see a very narrow range of 10 to the minus 2 to 10 to the minus 2, which is another indication of the high degree of homogeneity in the system. And the relative sororitivities have the benefit that they can be compared to obtain a qualitative assessment, give a qualitative assessment of the hydraulic connectivity of points within the system, which is represented here. So this represents the system. The green lines represent good connectivity, the yellow lines middling connectivity, and the red poor. And as you can see, just from quickly looking at it, there is generally good connectivity longitudinally, but fairly poor transversely. So on to the second part of the experiment, which was the dissolved oxygen. We placed 5 dissolved oxygen sensors next to the 4 piezometers that we pumped from. So 5 in each location, and 4 locations, so it was 20 in total. And as you can see, they were placed at different depths. Each sensor was an optical fiber sensor with one end coated in oxygen-sensitive foil. Each dataset, after it was obtained, was smoothed using a scarcity Gaussian filter with a window of 51 and 52 second-order polynomials. So here we have the results for A3. So these are, look at the top graph, these are the levels of oxygen for just the one location, the pumping well at A3, but at 5 different depths. The top 3 lines are meant to be interpreted with the left-hand side axis, and the bottom 2 lines with the right-hand axis. The middle graph represents the hydraulic head in the pumping well A3, which is of course where these oxygen sensors were also placed. And the bottom graph represents the precipitation that occurred in the Palamós during the time that we studied this. The time period is 6 days prior to the first pumping test and 6 days after the first pumping test. Each pink block that you see here in the top 2 graphs, these represent the period of pumping. So it goes pumping test 1, 2, 3, and 4. So starting with probably the most ideal looking oxygen line. So as you can see, there is a small. This is 4 days before pumping started, and you can see there was a response from the precipitation occurring, which of course is what you'd expect from oxygen-rich water precipitation falling from the sky and entering the system. And you see the same thing. So you see 2 peaks in precipitation, peaks in the hydraulic head, and peaks in the oxygen readings here. Then there's also clearly very distinct peaks in oxygen in response to the pumping for the first 3 tests. There isn't a 4th test, but this could be due to the fact that the pumping on this day occurred in DCP2, which is the point furthest from A3, and so maybe on this day it was too far for the effects to be felt in A3. And I'm afraid this is where the straightforward interpretation ends, because the rest of the signal, the rest of the oxygen data is much harder to assign any significance to. As you can see at the top line, the green line, which represents the data, the oxygen at the highest point, closest to the surface. There isn't a clear pattern occurring through these 12 days. The rises don't seem to coincide with any obvious factors, and so there's not really much more can be said about this irregularity. This magenta line here represents the next shallow point at 1.05 meters. As you can see, throughout this whole period, it read anisotropy, 0 ppm of oxygen. This in itself is not necessarily very significant. It could just be because if you remember that this sensor is just 1 point in the ground, it's only measuring a single point. It might just have been placed somewhere with very, very small pores that didn't allow any oxygen in, but it's not necessarily a comment on the oxygen in the rest of the system. And the reason that's truncated is because after this point, the sensor malfunctioned and had to be removed. The bottom 2 lines also represent the bottom 2 points in the tank. As you can see, they give very, very small values of concentration, and some oscillations that do seem to be slightly correlated with the pumping phases. But it's important to point out that both the absolute values that they're at and the oscillations are very, very small. So it's unlikely to lose significance to the biodiversity that we were talking about before. And in fact, the same can be said of the top 3 lines. They don't go beyond 0.2 ppm or 0.3 here. So considering how small these values are, you can't really assign much significance to it. So at the next point, B1, here we do have slightly more regular patterns. Once again, we have 1 point that showed anisotropy throughout. But for the rest, we see these clear peaks and troughs that occur when the pumping occurs, and have a periodicity of about 1 day. Unfortunately, we do also see the exact same peaks on the days that don't have any pumping. So there does seem to be some natural oscillation occurring, but the amplitudes do seem to be slightly larger on the days that there's pumping. And therefore, maybe you can say that there was some effect on the pumping on them. But once again, if you look at the magnitude of the oxygen concentration, it's very, very low, but it's below 0.03, and the oscillations are even smaller, on the order of 1,000th of a ppm. So it's hard to say that this has any significant effect on the biodiversity. And essentially, the same is seen in DCP1 and DCP2. The same types of regular pattern with a peak around midday and a trough at midnight, but with such small magnitudes that not much can be said. And it's more the same thing with DCP2. So just taking a step back and looking at the solid oxygen results, taking a very, very simplified model of it. You'd expect the dissolved oxygen content of the water arriving into the system to be relatively rich in oxygen, given that having been pumped, it's being aerated, and so you'd expect the water around section A to be highest and around D and C to be lowest, because as this oxygen-rich water passes through the tank, the oxygen is preferentially consumed in the biodegradation processes, and therefore it'll be highest at A and lowest at B. And of course, at the same time, they expect there to be a negative gradient with respect to depth, because at the surface, of course, this is an open system and therefore opens the atmosphere, and you expect to be some diffusion processes and other, especially diffusion, entering, making oxygen enter through here, but of course then diminishing actually go down the system. In the case of the first, the longitudinal concentration gradient, of course, you don't see that. In fact, the concentrations are highest in section D rather than B or A. And very small differences are found between A and B. And then looking at the second assumption or second supposition, we see that there's an uneven distribution of concentrations of oxygen across the cross-section, across the depth. And in D, in fact, whereas in D this is kind of found, you see that in the top three sensors there is a significant degree of oxygen, well, in relative terms, of course, whereas the bottom two there is no oxygen found at all. So one possible explanation for this would be that the water that enters the system is indeed does indeed have some oxygen in it, and as it passes through, because all of it enters in one go from the top, it spreads more or less uniformly through the section, and then as it passes, it does indeed consumed by the microbes in the oxidation of the organic matter. But and this could be why the bottom section here has been depleted in oxygen. But the fact that there's a lot more oxygen here than in these upper sections here could just point to the fact that there's something that's happening which is replenishing the levels of oxygen and it's giving these larger values. But of course, it's important to keep in mind that the oxygen concentration dynamics are very complicated and there are many factors going on, and therefore a lot more studies needed to come up with a reason with more confidence. So in conclusion, we've successfully characterized the hydrology of one of the tanks in the pilot project in Palamós. We've established a reliable estimate of the hydraulic conductivity and permissivity and the preferential flow paths in the tank according to the coefficients of storativity, which then go on to inform the design of the more complex chaotic flow experiments. We've characterized the result oxygen concentrations and seen that they are extremely low. We also haven't been able to find any significant effects from pumping, which is due to the fact that there were such low concentrations of oxygen, and no obvious correlations with the hydraulic conductivity determined from the tomography. However, as we know, the oxygen is a valuable and important factor in biodegradation, and so in the chaotic flow experiments, one aspect that we'll be looking into is finding ways to aerate the groundwater during the injection and extraction process. And finally, as we've seen that the oxygen is lacking in the system, one thing that we would also like to do is to perform a real characterization of the system to obtain a broader perspective of what's going on in the system regarding biodegradation. And that is all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Some questions, comments?
I have some intuition about 35 kg, 35 is used for 34. Yeah, that's why. That's why. I think my intuition is that CO2 will increase along the X.
CO2 or O2?
No, oxygen will increase. You said it will decrease along the X axis.
Yeah.
Why is you think it should decrease?
Because oxygen is the preferential terminal electron acceptor in biodegradation.
Sorry?
So you know in oxidation processes,
Yeah.
so the organic matter, so the water coming in, it's partially treated wastewater, and so it contains some organic matter, contaminant, but also there's also some oxygen in it. And when it reaches the soil, the microorganisms in the soil, they take the organic matter as the substrate, and the oxygen then it brings it together and produces a redox reaction, which so the oxygen is reduced and the organic matter is oxidized to basically and creates smaller products.
But so the oxygen should increase in the.
No, because oxygen is consumed.
It's consumed. So in the beginning, there's a lot of oxygen in the groundwater, and then you put the polluted water here, and it consumes a lot of oxygen. So it should decrease in the X, but in the far away from the source, it should have like a higher oxygen. I mean, before perturbation, before we do experiment, the groundwater might contain like oxygen increase with the increase from the
heights. Well, as I said, there's a significant. There's higher oxygen here than here.
It should be
increase.
Because there are two processes.
Probably more.
Of course, there is a reaeration because oxygen. So you have, let's say, anoxic. You could say you have anoxic water. So first it infiltrates. All the oxygen is consumed, and then it flows to the right. But of course, you have oxygen entering from the top. Of course, you could have a recovering of your something like that. Which could be, but in this case, because this is typically what happens in rivers. If you have in a river, and you have some contamination or maybe contamination at the point, then first the oxygen will drop and then it will go up. And that's it, typically observed. I would say that we are still here more maybe that we are dropping. Because when it goes up, we don't have any organic matter anymore. So if it's more or less clean, everything, all the organic matter is oxidized, and then the oxygen levels can go up again.
I guess it would be interesting if you compare it with the amount of oxygen that you have in the water that you have.
So I did mention that, but we have this. So in the rective barrier, which is where the water first goes in, it's around 8 ppm if I'm not mistaken, which is quite high.
So it's much higher than.
So when it enters here, it's very high. The concentration is 8 ppm, and here even around the top section, it's around 0.3, 0.2 ppm. So in this section here, so as soon as it enters, barely 5 meters after entering, it's already almost all consumed because it's a preferential species. And the fact that here it's higher than in A and B, so this top section of D is higher than A and B, to me indicates that there's replenishment from the atmosphere, maybe from the plants photosynthesizing as well. I'm not sure.
There's an 8 ppm is more or less when it's saturated with saturation of the atmosphere, oxygen in the atmosphere. But I would say you don't have any oxygen.
I agree. So that's why I'm saying from this point onwards, at least, before we don't know, but at this point, the oxidizing species involved in the biodegradation, if there is more biodegradation, will be others, nitrate, maybe iron. I'm not sure. We know there's iron in the system, so there could be iron performing the oxidation, but that's why the redox characterization would be useful to know more about what's actually happening.
Because I don't know, measurements about if EH is also.
In this experiment, no.
It's coming.
Yes.
And I know that at least there are examples, just the chemistry. And there are also samples of nitrate and sulfate. I think it indicates that we are already away from the aerobic situation.
Yeah.
I think there is sulfate reduction.
Even sulfate. Last one.
Wow, okay. Yeah, there
In some ways.
in some.
Yes.
I mean, in the middle there is a lot of sulfate. But,
Oh, already in the middle.
I don't know the D, because the D is a new one.
Yes.
So we don't have A, B, C.
Yeah, it's a new one. Yeah.
Because this is tank 1, and in tank 1 we have 4 more kilometers for counting pump.
So these CP1, CP2, CP1, CP2, those are later additions that have been put there to perform chaotic flow experiments.
I think I had a student, the graduate student who looked at it a little bit at these concentrations. These were taken a few years ago, I think. And the sulfate, I think more or less maximum in the B boreholes. And in the C, it was dropping again. It's maybe it's because of mixing. Because it's close to the
So you immediately had it from the same way.
So the divers in each one of these, right? Not all these green ones.
Yes.
So the first pumping test, we pumped from here, and we had the diver measurement here. But we also had divers across all of them. So that's why, for example, the first pumping test, the pumping was done from B1, which is this orange. You can't really see it, but it's the orange line. Right, and so you get the drawdown, recovery. But for this same pumping test, right, these are all happening at the same time. This is A3, BCP1 and CP2, the 2D plasmometers, and I'm at C1. That's why across all 4 days we have a hydraulic head in all locations.
So you have the same way. You pump from that one and you measure the head from the second.
Oh yeah.
So
Well, all of them. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. So there were 7 divers across the thing, and they were always on. Yeah, basically.
Okay.
thanks.
Someone else? Look at the Okay, so if there are no more questions, then well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And